Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to CNAS. My name is Vivek Chulakuri. I lead the Technology and National Security program here, and welcome to an event on countering China's digital Silk Road. We're honored to be joined by Dr. Kurt Campbell to open our event for the 30-minute fireside chat before we move into a panel moderated by James Palmer from Foreign Policy and an excellent cast of experts. But Dr. Campbell hardly needs any introduction, especially here at CNAS, the organization he helped found back in 2007 with Michelle Flournoy. But for those who aren't familiar with Dr. Campbell's distinguished career that spans nearly 4 decades across the private sector, academia, military service, and government, most recently, Kurt was the Deputy Secretary of State, where he led efforts to modernize the department to meet enduring global challenges and revitalize our diplomatic relationships. I could go on for at length about all of the things he's done in his career, but a few other highlights. Before the role as Deputy Secretary of State, Kurt was the inaugural Indo-Pacific Coordinator at the National Security Council and Deputy Assistant to the President from 2021 to 2024, where he, relevant to this conversation, helped oversee some efforts to imagine new forms of economic statecraft and strengthen partnerships with key allies across the Indo-Pacific. Since his time in government, Kurt's returned as the co-founder and chairman of the Asia Group, and where he's also continued to think about economic statecraft in the context of the U.S. China competition with a focus on technology, among many other areas. So given his illustrious career, we couldn't think of a better speaker for this discussion, which also marks the release of a new CNAS report on countering the digital Silk Road. Folks can get their copies outside if you haven't already. We'll talk a little bit about that in this discussion and in the later panel. But Kurt, let me just start. First of all, thank you again for making the time. I know there's a lot of places you could be, and we're grateful you're back here at CNAS. Let's just start with the pressing news from last week, as I'm sure people here are curious to hear your take on, as everyone knows, China surprised everybody by announcing controls on rare earths and magnets, and the Trump administration responded with threats of 100% tariffs on all goods coming out of China starting on November 1st. The supposed Trump-Xi meeting might be canceled, unclear, in a couple of weeks. What do you make of all the recent flare-up, and what do you think the lessons are for the U.S. China relationship going forward?
Well, first, Vivek, it's great to be here back at CNAS. My compliments to Richard Fontaine for all the good work that the Center's done. And can I just take a moment to compliment you on this report? And you will all have a chance to take a look at it and what Vivek and Ruby have done. This is like incredibly concise, actionable. If you want to understand what China's strategy has been on the digital scene, what the likely responses that are reasonable that the United States and other countries, this is a great thing. It's really steeped in expertise and actionable. It's not pie in the sky. It's very, I think, reasonable in terms of both its assessments and what can be done. So I would say to your question, I think you have to begin at a fundamental level. So if you think about the foreign policy sort of journey of the second Trump administration, initial focus largely on Latin America with numbers, how to deal with issues associated with uncontrolled immigration, almost militarizing some of these issues with Venezuela, then turning to matters associated with Russia and Ukraine, and then the Middle East, and most recently this really remarkable set of achievements in Israel. And I think now, as we head into the fall of his first year, he is turning his attention at a fundamental level to the Indo-Pacific. Over the course of the last several months, there has been some purposeful diplomacy between the United States and China. It is important to note, though, guys, that for the first time since diplomacy really began between the United States and China in recognition almost 50 years ago, the lion's share of the diplomacy is not actually being conducted by the White House. It's being done by the Treasury Department, and it reveals that the president thinks about some of the issues with China largely through the lens of the commercial relationship and less at a strategic level. I think it is pretty much undeniable that the president very much wants to go to China. I think he wants to try to figure out how to have a relationship with President Xi and believes that he has the touch to sort of return the relationship to a kind of détente. I think at the same time, both countries are maneuvering for advantage heading into a potential meeting around the edges of APEC. So if you look at really what Secretary Bessent has done with the Chinese vice premier, is they've basically provided a framework for meetings over the course of the next 6 to 8 months. The idea is a first meeting in Korea where maybe a few things are finalized around TikTok, but most specifically a formal invitation to President Trump to visit Beijing in early 2026, and then likely a return visit later in 2026 by President Xi to the United States. So that calendar is one of the ways to drive U.S. China relations. And I think the idea that he has is some short-term deals in agricultural to basically try to shore up some of his support in the western part of the United States, probably something on fentanyl. I think what he's prepared to put on the table is substantial, though, Vivek, in terms of technology. I think the president and his team have a different theory of the case. I think they're less about restrictions on certain kinds of capabilities flowing to China and more about the idea of locking in China to American systems. I don't think that's likely, and I think all you have to do is read President Xi to understand that he has no intention ever of allowing China to be reliant on foreign supplies of anything. And so just last thing to your specific question, I think there are a couple of theories of the case about what happened last week. One is that in response to a series of actions that the United States had taken on shipping and other actions at the Commerce Department, the Chinese, who had told us that they would respond to any steps that we took to restrict commerce or technology, came out with what I think is an absolute broadside against basically not just the United States, but all of our allies and partners with respect to rare earths and the like. One theory of the case is that the Chinese simply overreacted, and that this was a misreading of the sort of the strategic environment, and that they are now quietly trying to reassure the United States that don't worry about this, we'll try to figure out so it won't be as dramatic, and don't read too much into it. That's classic Chinese strategy. Don't clarify in public, but try to clarify privately. That would be probably number one. Number two is China is a unitary system, but there are competitive groups within the Chinese government. And just like in the U.S. government, the finance folks that are primarily involved in the diplomacy with the United States are countered by efforts in the Ministry of Commerce and also the United States in the Commerce Department, who have concerns about positioning strategically and are more concerned about seeking advantage, and that there was a little bit of a bureaucratic play. I'm not sure that President Xi fundamentally understood what was involved here, but it is also clear to me that the Chinese badly want this diplomacy with President Trump, probably for very different reasons that President Trump wants the diplomacy with China. But my expectations are that they will try to find a way forward, and there will be some kind of meeting on the edges of APEC, and I expect fully President Trump will go to Beijing in early 2026, and it will be a very different kind of visit. There will likely be CEOs with him, lots of focus on deals, and might even be issues associated with Chinese investment in the United States, which has been one of the issues that has, frankly, united Democrats and Republicans to try to block.
Yeah. Great, thanks for that, Kurt. And you mentioned the broadside. I mean, obviously, the broadside not just to the United States and allies and partners all over the world is not just to the economies, but also very specifically to tech, right? I mean, the rare earths, the magnets, everything from F-35s to the AI chips that we ourselves have restricted to China and other countries. I mean, let's maybe pivot now to the Digital Silk Road, which, we wrote this report because the DSR turns 10 this year, and I think, our assessment was that a lot of people don't really understand what it is, how it works, what its effect has been, and also taking stock of the U.S. and allied response, or in some cases lack thereof, for the past 10 years. But can you help us? I mean, you're someone who studies China's foreign policy. You've studied how they engage with the rest of the world. How can you help us understand how to conceptualize the DSR as part of China's broader foreign policy and global ambitions?
So, look, I think for those of us who work on the Indo-Pacific, we think of the dominant regional arena of competition as in this area, and that's been largely where the most substantial project associated with the Digital Silk Road and the broader Belt and Road set of initiatives are as well. But it is a mistake not to recognize that everywhere you go in the Middle East, everywhere you go in Africa and Latin America, you're going to stumble upon substantial, ambitious projects that are basically laying the planks for a much more robust Chinese engagement, initially commercially, technologically, finding ways for countries to buy into all the elements of a modern digital economy. You'll see that in every country in Africa. And frankly, I think the Western response has been generally lacking. You know, you ask, you talk about in your report about what the counter sort of response would be. In truth, if you look at instruments of power that the United States has wielded in this arena, the DFC has incredibly substantial resources, but probably not leveraged the way that we would, ideally like, and there's too many restrictions on the way they go about investing. We hear repeated statements that aid will be reimagined at the State Department, and that a key focus will be in the technology arena. We haven't really seen anything materialize yet, but generally speaking, what China is seeking to do is create a series of reliant relationships with countries that, frankly, will work with them on either infrastructure issues associated with technology or just devices per se. So you see that basically everywhere in the global south. There are countries that are seeking to compete with China in this arena. The most notable case is probably India, that is determined to play a role as a competing force with China in the global south. I think it's yet to be determined whether the United States will be effective in some of these places in this arena going forward. It is clear that many of these countries want access to the United States in technology, want to work with us, not just in AI, but across the board. Financing is challenging. What we've essentially lost in this country is what I would call elite consensus. If every 4 years you have abrupt, dramatic changes in programs which should be consistent over decades, it's very hard to build up a degree of consistency about what you're seeking. I would have thought on technology and investment that there had been very broad bipartisan consensus, but I think the Trump administration has some different views that are frankly different than what we've seen emerge among Democrats and Republicans, both on domestic investment and the kind of international priorities we might want to follow.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Kurt. I mean, I think if we are asking markets around the world to engage in long-term technological partnerships, which in their minds might entail a level of dependency in some domains with the United States, having the instability across administrations, whether or not you agreed with the diffusion rule, the fact that we went from a global regime that regulated the control of chips to having nothing suggests a whiplash in approach, and the lack of elite consensus. Even the fact that the DFC, right, as its reauthorization is, I think, since lapsed, even though it was a bipartisan organization. The fact that we can't come together in a bipartisan way and identify common goals that can endure across administrations and provide our partners with a sense of long-term assurance that what we are providing, whether it's sensitive technologies or investments, are not just going to disappear every 4 years or get completely rejiggered. Obviously, we have a democratic process that has a say in this, but it undermines our case, for sure.
I would say, if you look at some of the programs that are frankly being now ripped up after the Inflation Reduction Act and other these acts. They've been portrayed as really democratic or Biden foreign policy or national security or domestic investment acts, but largely they have been driven by entirely responsible, visionary Republican senators, Todd Young in particular and others. And so it's not just going against President Biden, but just a bipartisan theory of the case, which I found quite compelling about both domestic investment and also, you know, working more closely with allies and partners and shepherding some of our most critical capabilities, both in terms of AI, but also semiconductor manufacturing from, you know, going to actors which we think are, you know, operating in ways antithetical to our interests.
I mean, you mentioned the bipartisan piece. Senator Risch has a great bill that would quadruple the amount of investment authority that DFC has. And there are other reforms that we and others have called for to make tech an explicit priority of the DFC, to reduce some of the restrictions that limit it from being able to support projects that may incidentally benefit high-income countries like Singapore, for example. If you're trying to, you study in the Indo-Pacific, if you're trying to do subsea cable infrastructure in that region, it's going to have a landing point in Singapore, and the DFC should be able to support it and not be excluded just because it's a high-income country. Because it also, by the way, will touch Indonesia, it'll touch Malaysia, it'll touch a lot of other countries where we're actively competing with China.
Yeah, I would say one of the things that I struggled with, you know, like I worked a lot in the Pacific. It is the great game is afoot. The regional competition there is intense between the United States and China. We have consistently worked with close partners like Australia, like New Zealand, Japan, and others. But as you'd look at the tools in our kit, I never really liked that framework because it suggests that you kind of can see them down in a container and choose from them. It's much harder than that. But if you looked at all of our agencies, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, USAID, the DFC, the restrictions and the difficulties in the most basic agreements were profound and deep. And I was of the view that finding ways to do microfinance in certain areas in the Pacific were essential. Trying to erect a consortium of public and private banking and financial institutions, incredibly difficult, Vivek. And so going forward, my own sense is, you know, I hear two different things fundamentally coming out of the Trump administration with respect to, one is we're tired of spending this kind of money, and we should spend more of it domestically on the United States, and it's not worth it. And you hear that from some quarters, and then you hear others suggesting, no, we just have to be more efficient about how we do it, less controls, more ability to target it to purpose. My hope is the latter and not so much the former. But I would say basically the jury is still out really fundamentally about the direction ahead here.
Yeah. And you touched on some of this, Kurt, but I'd love to draw on your, you know, frontline experience working in the guts of the interagency, working with foreign partners. I mean, what are some of the tools you wish you had? How would you assess the interagency's ability to actually marshal the resources and programs that do exist across state and XM and DFC and USTDA, and there's a whole alphabet soup of organizations we sort of detail in the report and suggest ways to, frankly, streamline a lot of it. But what would you recommend?
So guys, I would just simply make a general point that there was a period, if you were in government in the 1980s or 70s, and you wanted to be relevant on the issues that mattered. That means you had to understand and be able to interpret the arcane dimensions of nuclear policy, throw weights and MIRVs and MARVs. And so that was the language and the elements of strategy. Increasingly, if you want to be effective in government, really effective, you have to understand elements of technology and understand how technology policy is made in the United States. And the challenge there is, first of all, very few of us are trained in even one of the key disciplines. So if you look at the areas that are going to be central, AI, semiconductors, robotics, synthetic biology, I mean, that's just a beginning. Quantum computing, any one of those would require very advanced study, Vivek, to be able to make a contribution. And I can't tell you, I mean, we have others here around the room who've been in meetings. I saw many times watched principals make decisions on issues that I was certain that they did not understand. And that's not unique to any administration. So there is a gap in understanding more generally. And so being able to recruit people who have more expertise and understanding in technology is going to be essential. And that's, I mean, like you could say, gee, that's a nice to have. We're in the midst of basically evacuating our government offices now. So I'm not sure whether that's going to be possible. The other thing that I'm struck by is the convening mechanism around technology was essentially the National Security Council. It brought together the key actors both at the NSC, but also the NEC, Commerce, DOD, other parts of the government that have responsibility for certain technology policy. It was a kind of a messy process, but that's basically what we had. Ultimately, we're going to need to create more capacity inside the U.S. government to understand technology and be able to make recommendations thereafter. I am worried that the NSC has largely lost its convening and strategic authority in some of these areas. I think basically technology policy is now made when a really senior technology, player from the private sector comes in and sells the president on something, and that's what we're doing. And I believe, having spent a lot of time with some of the senior people, their genuine view is, I don't want any involvement of the U.S. government. I want a libertarian approach. Let the market decide. We'll, and generally downplays the challenge associated with China at a strategic level.
Yeah. Yeah, you just talking about the need to build capacity. One of the things we emphasize in the report is technology diplomacy, which can take a lot of different forms. But if you focus specifically on the State Department, where you worked and led some modernization efforts, there have been efforts in the last administration to expand like cyber statecraft and training with Nate Fixold's shop. Yeah. There was a special envoy that I think has since been riffed or consolidated with the CDP and the State Department. But there are not really trained technology diplomats in the U.S. Foreign Service. There are some commercial service officers at Commerce, but China does prioritize tech expertise and science and S&T expertise when they are picking diplomats. And I mean, do you see, having worked in efforts to modernize the State Department, like what's the progress line that you see, or where do you think there are low-hanging fruit that we could?
Vivek, it's a great question. I will say that, generally speaking, I would say at a strategic level, at a theoretical kind of defining the problem level, the United States was late to understanding. China was much more advanced in their thinking about the role of technology in national strategy, and they were clear about it publicly. If we look at the speeches that President Xi gave in 2013 and 2014, they are the most transparent, clear statements of purpose in the realm of technology. The area that we made the most progress in over the course of the last decade, as you indicate, is largely in the cyber domain. And so the interesting thing on cyber is many different actors at the NSC, at the presidential level, at NSA, at the Department of Defense. My big issue was you'd get these guys in a room and sometimes they'd be like, well, I'm in charge. Well, no, I'm in charge. And so there were issues associated with like the hierarchy of responsibilities, and it cut through both domestic, because cyber basically bridged both domestic and international. It was very difficult sometimes to figure out who would be responsible for certain areas. I would say that is an area, though, that we've at least made progress in. I do not see the same, the two areas where I think we've tried over the last couple of years to make progress. One was in AI, the other was semiconductors. I don't think we made as much progress in either synthetic biology or quantum. There was a little bit of work done, but I think the idea is those are safe for the future. I am not sure what's going to survive there are a few key players in the White House who think about AI and semiconductors, but I'm not sure that there really is yet a national strategy beyond, let a thousand flowers bloom.
Yeah. Yeah. And look, there is some virtue into letting our companies do their thing. I mean, without a ton of U.S. government involvement, our AI companies, our cloud companies, our subsea cable companies have done our LEO satellite companies have established themselves in almost a dominant position globally. But the question is, is that how long is that going to last? China is obviously racing to close gaps, and they are marshaling their private sector and their public sector to try to compete. And if we have political tools that are not being mobilized, if we have strategic investment tools that are not being mobilized, we're sort of needlessly competing with one arm tied behind our back. Not that a interagency meeting is going to save us, but it can certainly help if done correctly. With the time we have left, Kurt, I just want to sneak in two more questions. Sure. Just to pivot a little bit, when you think about one of the challenges we identify in the report that I'm sure you observed from your time in government is you can't do everything everywhere all at once. We have limited and arguably declining resources. We need priorities in terms of which markets we're going to focus on and which technologies we're going to focus on. So do you have a view about which sort of key swing markets or emerging markets deserve focus from the U.S. government for this tech competition?
Yeah, so first of all, my own view is, and I wrote a little bit about this, I think our general theory of the case has to be this is the first time in our living memory, in our history, that the United States confronts an international challenge that we cannot handle on our own. If you look at industrial capacity in almost every venue, China has capacities despite its domestic challenges that are going to be enduring for decades. And so I do think there is a theory of the case in some places that China is weaker than they actually are. I think in all the ways that matter, their capacities militarily, robotics, technologically, manufacturing are going to be substantial for the next 20 or 30 years and inescapable strategically. So I would argue, Vivek, I think the most important element of international strategy, global strategy, is working more closely with allies and partners. And at the core of that should be technology. And that means bridging Europe and Asia in ways that we did a little bit in both semiconductors and quantum. I believe making that a dominant theory of the case is important. I don't think that view is necessarily accepted here. I think there has been much more tension in our bilateral partnerships than I would like to see. And I think the bridges that we tried to create between the Indo-Pacific and Europe, which I believe are fundamentally in our strategic interests, I don't think that's where the Trump administration believes work should be done. And their primary message to Europe is like, focus on your own continent, don't engage as much in the Indo-Pacific. Now, that is having a contrary response. It causes Europeans to frankly want to do more in the Indo-Pacific. So I would say beginning with that idea, working particularly with certain allies and partners. My honest view is that we will have to think very carefully about our plan of action with respect to AI. What happened in the Biden administration has continued in the Trump administration. The countries that have kind of forced decisions about the export of AI and issues associated with both, kinds of investments and what is entailed if you're going to do this at a fundamental way. It's the countries in the Gulf that have the finance, they have the money, they have the energy. I actually would probably make the argument that we would want to look more broadly, and there are probably some other like-minded countries that we would want to explore partnerships with. I think there is an argument to be made that we should look at other countries in the U.S. orbit, in Australia and in Europe, to see if there are more likely partners. I worry a little bit about the alignment of views. I think some of the countries in the Gulf continue to have certain kinds of relations with China that, even though they assure us not, turn out actually to continue to pertain. So I would say having a general theory of the case about where we'd like to take these partnerships forward is going to be essential. I think we, frankly, it would have been appropriate to stop and say, look, before we go head on into either UAE or Saudi, let's stop and reflect. But the power and the momentum and the determination of the companies just overwhelmed any effort that you might see to have, a little bit of restraint or a strategic step back to explore best options.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Kurt. And just to quickly on the point about allies and partners, I mean, even if the United States in an era of limited and declining resources cannot match China's domestic and foreign export subsidies on our own, surely if you add Japan, Australia, the EU with its global gateway program, bringing in assets like India's DPI, when you put all of these pieces together, as you've articulated in other contexts, surely we can match what China is able to offer as a broader team. And I think, having that level of ambition is going to be really important going forward.
Yeah,
but I also promised your team I would get you out of here soon.
Can I say just one thing on that? So I believe that strategy is going to be essential for the United States. I have made this point before, but you could argue, yes, of course, the U.S.-China relationship is going to be so important in the 21st century, but I could argue that the country that you need to get right in terms of strategic partnerships in education and technology, in military in the Indian Ocean is actually India. And you want a strong, robust relationship between Delhi and Washington. Now, that is difficult. I want to just posit that. It's challenging, but it's extraordinarily important. What has concerned me the most, if you ask the country after the President Trump's election, what country was most confident that they would be able to manage and be effective? It was India. They were completely, we've got this, we've got to get this done. What relationship has basically plummeted over the last 7 or 8 months? It is really the U.S.-India relationship. Now, it's not clear how much of that can be resurrected, but I would argue that if we're serious about technology, if we're serious about the maintenance of peace and stability, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but more broadly, a stronger relationship with India is so much in our strategic interests. And so what I occasionally struggle with is what is the theory of the case. Both Japan and South Korea are frankly desperate to have good relations with the United States. They're doing everything possible. It is challenging. They still haven't really concluded their tariff agreements yet. Japan is prepared to do almost anything to maintain that relationship with Washington, given the importance of a partnership that can hopefully be effective in the midst of an incredibly rising power in China.
Well, with that, Kurt,
thank you.
There's a lot more to cover, but we know we have to get you on to the next thing. We've got a great panel coming up next, but really grateful for your time and for your service.
Congratulations, and guys, really pick up this report. If you're interested in getting a shorthand about how to think about these issues, this is the report for you. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Kurt. And thanks to Ruby Scanlon, our co-author on this report.
Thank you, Ruby.
Who did a great job. All right, thanks.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. And thanks to Kurt and Vivek for that very interesting discussion before. I'm James Palmer. I'm an editor at Foreign Policy, specializing in China. And I'm very lucky today to be joined by three extremely interesting panelists. And if you'd like to just maybe say a sentence or two about yourselves for the audience first.
Sure. My name's Ruby Scanlon. I'm a research associate at CNAS. Co-authored this report. Before this, I was at the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division and then studied in China as a Schwarzman scholar. And now at CNAS.
I'm John Hillman. I'm a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of a book called The Digital Silk Road.
Hello, I'm Ruth Berry. I'm the head of policy at NVIDIA in our government affairs team. And prior to this role, I worked at the State Department for many years, including on technology policy.
So I believe we have a mechanism for taking questions from the audience through the CNAS website. And I'll be trying to weave those in to the talk. And then maybe at the end, we'll take sort of 5 to 10 minutes to concentrate on those. But Ruby, let's start off. China has a lot of big programs. It loves big programs. You've got the Belt and Road Initiative itself, which was sort of two things stapled together. You have the Global Security Initiative. You have the Harmonious World back in Hu Jintao days. They've just launched the Global Governance Initiative, I believe. But a lot of these end up being kind of boondoggles or not really meaning much. They're grandiose kind of words. Is the Digital Silk Road actually a useful framework? Does it matter to China? And should it matter thinking about this as like a specific object to the United States?
Well, I think it is very much an entity in itself and not the boondoggle, as you would say, even if China wants to slap names on initiatives. Quite often. I think you just look at the investment numbers, and Digital Silk Road investments have increased almost tenfold in the past 3 years alone. The Belt and Road Initiative and the Digital Silk Road itself is at peak investment nowadays. And we've just seen this large and sustained push for technology in the past decade across China, from go global to new quality productive forces to the Digital Silk Road, and they really see technology as the primary way to achieve an advanced and modernized economy. I think it's interesting as well that the slapstick name on the Digital Silk Road has kind of disappeared in recent years as well in an interesting way. In a similar way that we saw with Made in China 2025, where Chinese authorities will receive backlash to the initiative, as they have with Made in China 2025, as they have with Digital Silk Road. And so when you actually look at the policy documents over the past 10 years, the Digital Silk Road isn't really being talked about anymore, even though we're at peak investment. So I think there's this interesting relationship there.
As you say, there's this kind of awareness that Washington picks up on these. I mean, we saw them even going back on the BRI after everybody in Washington got very excited about the BRI in sort of 2017, 2018, started calling it the new Marshall Plan and so forth. John, we've talked about all these different aspects of technology, and obviously the big one nowadays is AI, and we see this constant focus on AI. And in a way, that's kind of a little bit comforting for the United States because it's one of the few areas where there's still a clear kind of US advantage, even if that advantage is narrowing. But what are the areas that China is most interested in? What areas are countries across the world looking to China for support in?
Yeah, this is a great question and an important development. So I published a book on China's DSR about 4 years ago, almost to the day, and this is one of the major developments in that period. You know, the rise of AI, which was talked about at that time, and it was incorporated into some systems, primarily surveillance systems. But AI is much more capable now, and it's integrated into everything from a trash can that's going to tell you when it needs to be emptied in a municipality to some of those more traditional surveillance systems that we think about. And clearly there is a big demand for that full range of services. I think this report does quite a good job looking at a few key areas where there's both, I think from the U.S. perspective, these are areas that are both commercially important as well as there's some higher stakes involved because of the collection of data and some of the dual use purposes. So just to name a few of them, the subsea cable space is an area where the Chinese went from having almost no capability 20 years ago to having one of the world's 4 companies that can do turnkey delivery of these systems. In the satellite domain, the Chinese are they've been providing geostationary satellites for quite some time, but they're getting more active in the low Earth orbit area. Smart cities, or safe cities as they're branded by some Chinese firms, is another big area. And when I think about the demand for this, I think sometimes it's helpful to not do the sort of foreign policy, national security hat first, but maybe imagine yourself as the mayor of a city, and someone comes to you with this system and they tell you, you can increase your sort of your response times for emergencies, you can make traffic flow more easily, you can reduce crime. All of these, it's a great sales pitch, right? And baked into that are some serious surveillance concerns. I don't want to dismiss that, but it's the benefits, I think, that are often selling these systems, and particularly in China's case, in emerging markets.
And this sort of picks up with something I wanted to ask Ruth. So when we think of all these things, we sort of think of this zone of competition between the US and China that involves all these countries that are, leaning one way, leaning the other, maybe allied with the United States on some issues, with China on others. When it comes down to the sort of on-the-ground stuff, what do they want from American companies? What are they looking for? And how can American companies kind of provide what China can't, or compete on what China's already offering, maybe better in some cases?
So I think it's important to think about AI and how countries are viewing it, which is with a lot of excitement. I think countries around the world, at both the national, state, and local and economic levels, are really excited about the potential of this technology. And I agree with what you said. They're looking at how can this be used to help us better serve our citizens? How can this enable and rev up our innovation ecosystems, help our startups grow, help with education, agriculture? And so I think countries are thinking about AI, one, very sectorally, and how it's going to transform every segment of the economy. And I think that they have choices. I know that for many, the US does have a lead in sort of leading edge AI infrastructure, but we're not the only provider. Huawei is incredibly capable. Their chip production capacity is growing every day, and they've made very clear that they see AI as an integral part of their digital Silk Road efforts. And it's a formidable commercial competition. And so we want US companies to be able to compete and win around the world, and whoever deploys this infrastructure is also going to help set the standards and build the developer ecosystems on top of that infrastructure. And so I think one thing countries are looking for are, they want to access the stack at different layers. They may have different needs. They may be at different parts of their AI journey. And so whether it's the compute layer or at the cloud or the model layer, they want to use open source models and fine tune it on their own data and their own languages. And so I think ensuring that countries have the flexibility to choose American at all layers of the stack. And also that American companies are a reliable partner. And I think regulatory consistency is really important. Countries are making huge investments in infrastructure to help shape their economic futures, and they want to know that that infrastructure will be able to be serviced and supported in the years to come.
So talking of regulatory consistency, one of China's selling points in general has always been, you have the same Chinese government next year as you did the last year. Maybe you have the same people in power for a long time. Maybe those people get purged overnight. Sometimes that happens too. Rather infamously, Mark Zuckerberg formed a close relationship with one of the top Chinese tech people who then fell during Xi Jinping's early round of purges, which was one of the factors that turned Facebook off China in the long term. So China sells this consistency, but even if it isn't always there, but America is getting to the stage of, as Kurt mentioned before, really wild swings in its approach to regulation and its approach to government. Is there anything that private companies, that individual actors can do to counter that? And how does this look to the people trying to make a decision between, US and Chinese options? And I'll just sort of throw this open to the panel.
I'm happy to start if it helps. Look, I think there's a lot of considerations that may come into play when someone's making a decision about what system to use, what solution to use. I think there are a set of security considerations, and those are often quite talked about, but I actually think that might not always be at the top of the list. I think cost is really number one, and then often sort of what is part of that package. We can talk about individual pieces of it, but I think what China has done quite effectively in different environments is to offer the full solution that it could be at different scales for someone's appetite, right? So everything from literally a data center that's the size of a shipping container that someone, the mayor of some tier 3 city can do a ribbon cutting ceremony and say, we've got our sort of local data center up and running, to larger, much larger efforts. And packaged with that is there's the physical infrastructure, there's the training, there's in some cases, literally operating these things. And so I think all of that comes into play as part of the sales pitch. And the sort of consistency piece, I think it probably matters, but ultimately not as much as just that upfront cost and sort of what's on the menu.
I think from a U.S. company perspective, we want to compete and win around the world, and I think the way we sort of approach that is working with countries, helping meet them where they are, offering solutions that are tailored to their needs, their regions, their economies, helping them build AI that's relevant in their languages and their contexts. And when it comes to engaging governments, we seek to educate what we know about the technology as technologists to help inform government decision making.
So, Kurt also talked a little bit about the fact that most people in US government do not understand technology. And, this is a problem that isn't unique to the United States. And I wanted to kind of ask, do we think that China actually understands technology? Like, we often see these discussions of China supposedly having engineers as leaders, but if you look at the top leaders' backgrounds, they maybe spent 2 years at university in the 1970s in some cases. Their entire experience has been in this extremely restricted and cutthroat political system. Where are they getting their knowledge about technology from, and do they have a real vision of technology? And maybe Ruby, do you want to take this one?
Sure, yeah, I appreciate the reference to Dan Wang's engineering empire, litigation nation of sorts. But I think what's most important is that China understands the importance of technology in its policy setting and has for the past 12 years. But I think what's most important that the US is missing out on, and Kurt Campbell and Vivek talked about it earlier, is kind of the technology diplomacy and the boots on the ground to make these deals work. And to help Chinese companies win those key bids and government procurement decisions on your next subsea cable or telecommunications infrastructure. And in our report, we talk about how there are S&T, science and technology, counselor stations at 52 Chinese embassies. And the United States doesn't have anything to compare itself with. It has the commercial diplomacy force, but they're only in a few select embassies, and there's only very few of them, and we don't have specifically trained science and technology diplomats, and I think we would do much better if we did have those. And it's one of our key recommendations in the report to pilot a cohort of foreign technology diplomats. I think it would go a long way in securing key bids and being able to use that knowledge and understanding of the technology to actually inform government procurers in those decisions.
I mean, this is something that's always struck me with Chinese diplomacy in general, is that they're very willing to put you onto a single track early and keep you on that track, whether it's taking some bright 22-year-old and training him up in like West African languages, and that's going to be what he does for the next 25 years. Whereas the US has traditionally taken this approach that's more or less, you are a clever person and you did well on the exams, and we're going to have you in Jamaica 1 year, and we're going to have you in Pakistan the next, and you're going to go from being a security expert to being a terrorism expert to being a technology expert. Is that a broader problem? Does the US actually have the capability inside the State Department to take on these kind of technical challenges, especially in an area where we're just, burning entire departments every day?
So yeah, I do think this question of state capacity is really important. And then related to it, but slightly distinct, is also this question of capacity and interest in the private sector too, because I'm also struck by, when you look at the map, there are areas where Chinese companies are showing up where, you know, the large U.S. tech companies, no one's getting up in the morning to think about, you know, that smaller market. And part of that's out of necessity because they've been squeezed out of some of the advanced economies, and in order to continue to grow, they need to focus on those overlooked markets. But I see those places getting then more attention, both from the private sector as well as some of the public sector officials, because of some of the challenges that you were highlighting.
And, you know, it's very easy for us to think about the US problems because the US is relatively open. We all live here. We all get to hear the gossip. We all complain when our friends get fired. From the Chinese perspective, what are the internal contradictions inside the Chinese system? What are the clashes between different departments or between what private companies want and the government wants that, you know, maybe hamper some of these Chinese efforts? And Ruth, I'm especially interested in if, you know, you've talked to Chinese counterparts at all about this, if you have any sense of sort of the frustrations they feel. I mean, we saw stuff like the massive tech purges, you know, in the last few years where companies really got slapped down by central regulators and so on.
Well, I can't speak to necessarily divisions within the Chinese system on these specific issues, but what I can say is that their companies are innovating. Over half of the world's AI researchers are Chinese. It represents about 30% of the global market for AI, and I think they are going to develop and grow, and they're focused not necessarily on artificial general intelligence or this idea of superintelligence, but how can AI be applied to specific sectors where China already has strong advantages, whether it's manufacturing. Other people had mentioned robotics earlier. And so I think they are really continuing to innovate and push forward, not just AI, but the application of AI, and then working in some of these other small, underserved or other markets to really push out globally. And so I think it's very important, again, as people consider the digital Silk Road and the state of AI, to understand that the competition is here. And despite sort of desires or policies in the past to try and prevent that, that's not the world we're living in today. And so then the question really is, what can the U.S. do to help ensure that U.S. companies compete and win? And I think the AI action plan announced by the Trump administration, I think really does seek to tackle some of these challenges around U.S. commercial diplomacy tools and how it can work to how the U.S. government can better support exporting the U.S. stack around the world.
John Ruby, any thoughts on the Chinese side of these kind of conflicts, these private kind of government tussles?
I mean, I think it's a fascinating question, because when we see these slogans, I think one of the things that's challenging with the slogans is it can sometimes give you the impression of perhaps too much central control over these activities, right, which are very diffuse, many actors with different agendas. You know, you see this also in the sort of more traditional infrastructure space as well, where often on the ground, it may be a large Chinese state-owned construction company that is the most influential, more so than the, you know, embassy official that's nominally supposed to be overseeing the project. So I do think that we have to look at these things and recognize that different actors have different agendas. It's not always hyper-coordinated, and in fact, on the U.S. side, maybe there are opportunities to take advantage of, you know, where those agendas aren't aligned or where there's friction.
I was very interested by you mentioning this focus, you know, in China, not on artificial general intelligence, but on these kind of practical applications. And I think that's something we've seen across a lot of kind of Xi's speeches in particular, is this focus on technology and manufacturing, technology and industry, this sort of almost hardware over software approach, whereas the US seems very enamored with, you know, trying to build a machine god by 2027 or whatever. I also noticed that OpenAI today announced that they were going to let ChatGPT do erotica. So that's an area where we will have a distinct advantage on the Chinese, because they're never going to allow that. It's this will be a major selling point in a lot of the world.
That's what our next report's about.
Exactly. You know, CNAS is staying on top of these issues, I hope. I've spent a lot of time trying to get DeepSeek to the point where it will start telling you something, and then it suddenly stops halfway through and says, you know, I'm sorry, this is not permitted by safety and regulations. So this is a wider point here. What are there aspects of of Chinese political restraint that both maybe push AI in particular directions or limit it, and that maybe help them think about aspects of application of AI, application technologies that Silicon Valley, which is quite detached from a lot of other industry, misses?
Yeah, happy to speak on that, and I think there's three areas where China, vis-a-vis the United States, has been really smart about AI push in key emerging markets. I think you tapped into one, at least in messaging. The United States is so obsessed with reaching artificial general or super intelligence, whereas, when you look at China's AI Plus plan, it is all about integrating artificial intelligence across various sectors of the economy. And I think the United States is starting to go a bit more into that direction, but I think that's the right focus. The second one, I think China's been really, really good about bundled or integrated packaging. We saw this AI in a box push where you're layering aspects of the hardware stack with models, with model evals, with applications, and you're bundling all of that so it's really easily accessible for perhaps less technologically advanced states to tap into and to integrate into their economies. And I'd say the third is just the messaging from the U.S. government, which perhaps maybe in D.C. we overblow how important that is, but the Chinese and American AI plans were released in just a month of each other, and the U.S. plan talked about AI dominance, and the Chinese AI Plus plan really talked about meeting key emerging markets' ambitions and helping them aspire and using AI to develop their own economies and meeting them where they're at. And especially really hitting on this sovereign AI push that many emerging markets are pushing towards. So I think those three areas, China has been really smart in that, U.S. models are currently far more widely dispersed, and Ruth knows that American compute is as well. But with strategies like this, China might be on our tails, especially on model diffusion.
It's a recurring theme again that we've heard from smaller countries or less developed countries that the Chinese are more understanding, more sympathetic to where they are, whereas the US tends to have this sort of, very from the mountaintop approach in demanding the rest of the world meets its things. And this links up to a question from the audience here from Caitlin. How do we compete with China on technology in countries that don't prioritize human rights, would rather buy the most effective product? And I'd ask more broadly, how much does human rights, especially questions around surveillance and privacy, have to be a concern of the approach we take here? And I'm going to throw that open, anybody who wants to take it.
So, look, I think competing in foreign markets doesn't necessarily mean competing in every market. So I put that out there, that there are places where it's okay not to go. But then I would also think about, are there ways that the U.S. can offer a solution that has safeguards? I, at one point when I was writing this book 4 years ago, I spent a lot of time doing the training for Hikvision automated surveillance systems, right? Going through the manuals and seeing how, and there were no safeguards. It was all, every function was, allowing you to do more and more, and with, zero warning or even being sort of self-conscious at all about how this may be problematic. So I think that there are opportunities to integrate into the offer safeguards, to make some of these products more humane, and to try to reduce some of those risks that make lots of us uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think from a company perspective, so NVIDIA is committed to safe and secure and trustworthy AI, and I think we build tools. So we, for the most part, are not making consumer-facing AI models, right? We build platforms that help our partners build and innovate and develop tools, and I think it's important to think about sort of the norms and standards behind which these tools are being deployed. And so I think a lot of it does come down to policies and the importance of governments working together to think about the standards and norms that make sense for how this technology is developed and deployed. But there are a lot of tools out there, whether they're built into models or can be added on as open source tools to help ensure that these models are more safe and secure. And so I think I think it's important to think about it in the context of lots of different commercial applications and their potential for use and misuse. I don't know that, AI certainly brings its own challenges, but I think that these sorts of things have existed for a long time where there are risks and thinking about the costs and benefits of deploying them in light of that.
Yeah, I mean, with Hikvision, as John mentioned, we saw that being used very widely to do ethnic profiling to basically identify Uyghur in Chinese cities, especially outside of Xinjiang, and to pretty much immediately put the police onto any kind of Uyghur face that showed up. And this comes to this question too of that I've seen less discussion of, I think, in recent years, but the question of like data and access to data and the use of data as a resource being perhaps more ethically restricted in the US and less so in China. I mean, questions like these huge databases of facial recognition, or personal data from companies. Is that a Chinese advantage? Do the Chinese have an advantage in that they can perhaps be more roughshod with where they get their data from?
Yes, I think they certainly can be, and I think it goes back to what Jonathan mentioned of we shouldn't and can't meet all demand that exists, and so even if it is a Chinese advantage, how they handle data, it shouldn't be one that American firms should necessarily compete on. But when you look at BGI Genomics, which is China's Huawei for biotechnology, they have pretty rough and loose data laws, and so they've been able to really advance their technologies at home by selling their technology and gathering all of that data and bringing it back. Also, CloudWalk Technology, which is a facial recognition firm, has also been able to deploy across key emerging markets and gather data that they typically don't have with a highly majority Han ethnic Chinese population and use that technology to thus improve their platforms and sell it even more widely. Again, it's perhaps not something that American firms should compete on every single time, but it certainly is an advantage, I'd say.
So I wanted to just throw it open to the audience in terms of hands up. If anybody has questions or follow-ups for our last sort of 10 minutes or so. I see Richard there jumping in.
Thank you. Richard Fontaine, I work here at CNAS. You guys touched a little bit on this, but I'd ask maybe to think about it a little more specifically. If we're going to counter the digital Silk Road, if the United States is going to spend its own resources, spend its own energy, bandwidth, whatever, then presumably we are either hoping to avoid a harm or achieve a benefit. What are the harms specifically that we're trying to avoid if China builds out the digital network in a small African country or a country in Central America and South America, or pick whatever? I mean, what are we really worried about that is worthy of a significant effort to counter those activities?
Yeah, happy to start. Look, I think we're talking about a country that has shown repeatedly a willingness to weaponize its hold of supply chains, and so I think it's not, it's not too much of a jump to imagine the weaponization of digital dependencies to try to achieve some type of objective, whether that's during negotiations in the short term, or if it was during a contingency, which I think kind of gets us maybe into a different category of concerns. But I mean, even historically, right before World War II, countries were cutting each other's telegraph lines, right? And the British were well positioned because they had established a whole network and also dominated some of the equipment that was needed to repair these things and lay them. And so there's definitely, I think, serious need, or a need for serious thinking about what happens in contingencies. And then maybe also a category of just peacetime surveillance and intelligence concerns, depending on particular locations and partners.
I'll also add, not taking a hard security look at this, Google and Microsoft and other U.S. tech giants receive and derive roughly 50% of their total revenue from foreign sources, and that revenue is used to empower further innovation and further research and development processes. Already, Huawei reinvests a higher share of its revenue in R&D. And I think if you deplete those foreign revenue sources, you might see less money going into American jobs, American salaries, and future innovation to export its technologies from there. And so you could see potentially the snowball effect of diminishing U.S. exports that cuts our lead in innovation and the like.
Yeah, I agree completely with what Ruby said and the importance of sort of access to global markets to continue to drive technological investments and innovation and R&D and frankly, you know, revenues to the U.S. Treasury. The other thing I want to talk about too is the developer ecosystem and the importance of that. And it's not just big markets. So AI is a great democratizer. It enables people to really innovate and create that may not have the same level of technical expertise that was required in the past. And there's going to be new applications that we haven't even thought of today that are going to be developed all over the world, including from small markets. And so when you have developers developing on your platform, they help debug it. It can help ensure that you can work to add new features that could be important to the innovation that they're doing, and it creates a continuous product improvement cycle. And then the applications that they develop, if they were developed on your hardware platform, then your hardware, they are optimized to your platform. And then as those applications spread out and grow, it creates more demand for the US technology stack. And so there's this virtuous flywheel with developer ecosystems that's incredibly important, which is why it's critical that the US and US companies are able to compete and win in markets around the world, not just a few big markets or just allied markets. I think it's really critical.
Grand, let's see if there's anybody else in the audience. At the back.
Hi, thank you so much. Melissa Schombuck from RAND. Just a follow-up question on that. In a world in which we just can't compete on price point for most countries realistically, what do you think should be the role of not just the U.S. government, but also U.S. companies in making their products more viable in these markets if it's so important for their own dominance? And of course, there's this national security aspect, but what would you like to see U.S. companies doing?
I mean, I think, we are a global company. We do compete in markets around the world. So, I think a lot of companies are doing the same. So I'm not sure that I would say at this point, there's a pricing out. I think U.S. companies do have a lot of advantages, certainly in the artificial intelligence space, not just NVIDIA, but many other companies as well, that we are able to compete around the world today.
And a question I just wanted to follow up on. We've talked a lot about the kind of relationship, what private companies want, and so forth. What about when private companies want things that are maybe bad for the United States? And I think here of the fact that the US, especially under Trump, has kind of gone all in on crypto at a time when China has basically killed crypto internally. Are there lobbying forces inside the US that are bad for, on the private side, that are perhaps bad for US strategy, for US goals? And I'm not going to ask this one. Let's go to John and Ruby. Both reluctant to take this question. That's when you know it's a good one.
Crypto on the digital Silk Road, I think, is the next edition of the report. Honestly, I may not have too much to add there other than to maybe make a version of the same point I made about China's activities. The U.S. has different actors with different agendas, and part of the challenge, it's actually more challenging for the U.S. government to cajole its companies to do things that they don't want to do. I personally think that that's ultimately an advantage because it leads to fewer white elephant projects, but it also creates a need for targeted government assistance and coordination in areas where the commercial fundamentals might not be strong enough, right? And so using aid in a targeted way, using U.S. presence at the World Bank and other development institutions to try to pursue those projects and be present in markets that may be a little bit more challenging commercially.
And this ties into a question we have from online, again from Caitlin. How do we streamline U.S. commercial and international development agencies to better counter the digital Silk Road? And maybe this is a question for a future administration, because right now we're streamlining most development agencies by burning them down.
You may have thoughts.
Yeah, I think there's a lot the United States can do to consolidate all of its exhaustive tools and authorities that have been established over so many different presidencies and tenures. I mean, we recommend collapsing Exim Bank, US TDA, DFC, because they have so many overlapping tools and authorities and pots of money to derive from that they lose strategic focus. And so perhaps consolidating them under one agency, under one house, also consolidating ITA's international markets analysis group under that. I think, you know, when you have so many diffuse pots of money, it just creates a lack of coordination, or at least difficulties coordinating. And just over time, every president has wanted, you know, a new development agency to kind of hang their hat on, and so consolidating those might go a long way and driving more strategic mission in its initiatives.
Okay, and I think we have time for maybe one more question from the audience.
Hi, I'm Hannes from Estonian Embassy. How could US and Europe work together better to counter China's digital Silk Road?
Very good question. Who wants to take it?
I mean, I know Ruby has material in the report on this probably, but I mean, it strikes me that the U.S. needs to work with several partners. I think this was touched on in the conversation beforehand, but you know, the U.S. is not the only one pursuing a sort of competing set of activities. The EU has Global Gateway and other initiatives, right, that may not be necessarily branded but are important and consequential. And so I do think it's worth finding opportunities to work together. Often that's very difficult on a project level because we all bring our own tools with our own specific financing requirements. There's a couple of examples of this working well in the Indo-Pacific and the Pacific Islands in particular, but very challenging in practice. And so maybe it's better to maybe work on complementary projects, you know, nearby, and or try to enable each other in areas where we might not be as present, right? So just playing to that natural focus that you may already have that could be complementary.
I have personal appreciation for Estonia on this one, because Estonia was the first country I ever went to that had fully accessible public Wi-Fi, and I remember thinking, oh my God, this is the future.
You were right.
I know. It's that, you know, things I've tracked that have turned out to be horribly important. It's a long and weird list, including things like Chinese internet cafes merge and bizarre little Chinese vertical dramas that are now a $7 billion industry. It's a very strange world out there. And on that note, I think we're going to wrap for today. Thank you so much to all our panelists. You've been wonderful. Thank you to the audience. And thank you to CNAS for hosting.